And can I welcome everyone to the fifth meeting of the Education and Skills Committee in 2021. Can I please ask everyone to turn mobile phones and other devices to silent during the duration of the meeting. Agenda item 1 is to consider the following negative instrument, the repayment of student loans Scotland Amendment Regulations 2021 SSI 2021/8. Details of the instrument are in the paper, and do members have any comments on the instrument? If you could indicate by putting an R in the chat. I'm not seeing anyone wanting to come in, so thank you very much for that. And we can now move to agenda item 2. Just before we start, can I say this is my first stage 2 bill process as convener. I know some of the members will have done other stage 2 in other committee duties. I'll endeavour to get through it as efficiently as possible. Can I just say before we start, when we move to debate on an amendment, if members wish to speak to an amendment, I will, could they indicate by putting an R in the chat. If they wish to intervene on a speaker during the debate process, if they could please put an I in the chat, and I'll give further information on division if we come to one during the bill process. So our next item of business is the consideration of Stage 2 amendments of the Redress for Survivors Historical Child Abuse and Care Scotland Bill. And I move immediately to section 1 in the area of the waiver. And can I call Amendment 1 in the name of Ian Gray, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings? I draw members' attention to the pre-emption information on this group contained in the groupings document. If Amendment 3 is agreed, I cannot call Amendment 43. If Amendment 17 is agreed, I cannot call Amendment 100 in the group initial determinations. Can I ask Mr Gray to move Amendment 1 and speak to all amendments in the group?
Thank you very much, Convener. I speak to Amendment 1, I move Amendment 1 and speak to the other amendments in my name in this group. And it is, I think, quite appropriate that this group is the first to be debated, because it does absolutely go to the heart of the purpose of this bill. The redress scheme is the final stage, as we know, in a very, very long process of recognising the appalling treatment suffered by many children in Scotland when they were supposed to be in our collective care. It took years for their stories to be heard at all, years more for those stories to be believed, longer still until an apology was made to them, initially by then First Minister Jack McConnell, and years more until their experience was formally investigated and recognised in an inquiry. It's taken yet longer until we have before us the legislation which will provide them with redress. The abuse they suffered has blighted their whole lives, and those lives have been further hurt by the struggle they have faced for justice. So we all want to get this right, and above all to get it right for survivors. The bill we pass and the scheme it creates must, above all, be one which survivors trust. And yet the bill before us, as presented, as introduced, has at its heart a measure which threatens to compromise that trust, a measure, as the committee have heard, that some survivors consider to be a betrayal. It is the waiver, a requirement that if a survivor benefits from the redress scheme, they must give up their right to civil justice. Now, the Cabinet Secretary has argued to the committee that this is necessary to ensure that care providers in whose care survivors were abused contribute to the scheme. And it is true that survivors want them to do that. But the Cabinet Secretary has been unable to put before committee the evidence that this is the critical thing which will ensure contributions are forthcoming. The evidence the committee heard from potential contributors was that while a waiver might be helpful to them, it was not the critical factor. That was the affordability of the contribution required and the fear of a commitment without limit, which we will deal with in other sections of the bill. These providers were at best ambivalent about the protection the waiver purports to provide. Now, in all of this, we have to remember that contributions are voluntary, with or without a waiver in place. There is no compulsion. So effectively, we are asked to include within the bill a measure which threatens to undermine the scheme in the eyes of survivors, all in the interests of those who historically allowed the abuse to happen without even thereby creating a compulsion on them to contribute. The key amendments in this group are 6 and 7, which would remove the waiver requirement. The others in my name consequential on this. Now, I acknowledge that the Cabinet Secretary has made significant efforts to mitigate the effect of the waiver, but it remains in place even where the amendments he has brought forward to be carried today. He has not managed to square the circle of waiver and contributions, and given the choice, we should choose to square that circle on the side of survivors, protect their rights and their confidence in the bill before us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Gray. Could I invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 38 and other amendments in the group?
Convener, I thank Mr Gray for raising the issue of the waiver. Waiver has been a key issue throughout the scrutiny of this bill, and it is important that we discuss it today. I also want to thank the committee for their careful consideration of this complex and sensitive matter. Over the past weeks and months, we've all been navigating our way through a wide range of evidence and an even wider range of views on this issue. That pushes us to see us explore alternatives, and we've looked far beyond our shores at the experience of other schemes. The result of this exploration and contemplation has, for me, confirmed my belief that the inclusion of waiver represents the best possible way of delivering a collective approach to redress that secures the financial contributions survivors want and deserve. There can be no mistaking the commitment and desire of all of us in Parliament to do the very best we can for the survivors that our country has let down so badly. I fully acknowledge that there are no easy options, but I continue to believe that waiver is the best option available to us. Waiver is an important mechanism to encourage the participation of organisations. It is the only route to securing meaningful contributions at a level that can be considered fair and appropriate. Waiver helps to secure financial contributions by reducing the risk of litigation that organisations, the Scottish Government and local authorities would otherwise face in relation to abuse covered by the scheme. By reducing this risk, those organisations are able to commit to larger contributions than would be the case if there was no waiver, and the risk of future litigation was not reduced.
Cabinet Secretary? Cabinet Secretary, sorry to interrupt. One of our members would like to intervene, if you're willing to take the intervention.
Of course, yes.
Mr Neil?
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Can I say, as the Cabinet Secretary knows, I've been enamoured with the waiver, but I recognise he's gone a long way in his amendments to try to deal with the concerns of survivors. However, there is one major concern to a small number of survivors, and that would be if after signing a waiver additional information became available, which would mean they had a good chance of success in a court in getting substantially more compensation and more redress. So will the government consider between now and stage 3 looking at the possibility of amendments to address that situation, so if any survivor finds themselves in that situation, then the waiver could be waived?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener, and I'm grateful to Mr Neil for the intervention. I've listened carefully to the concerns raised by survivors and others on this point, and if new evidence emerged, the amendments that I'm putting forward would allow redress payments already accepted to be revisited to take account of that fact. Now, I want to create a redress scheme which is fair to survivors. That means empowering them to make the right decision with independent legal advice to choose the right path that they can take. Now, I brought forward amendments to make sure that survivors have the time they need to make those decisions, and that the scheme is open long enough to allow them to fully explore other options. They also have the option to pause their redress application at any time before a determination is made. However, Mr Neil makes an important point, and I will look again at this in advance of stage 3. If there is more that we can do to strengthen the safeguards for survivors, then we certainly will aim to do so. And Convener, the primary purpose and the intention of the waiver is to ensure that those who are seen as responsible contribute to the scheme and to the national response to historic child abuse in care in Scotland in a sizeable and meaningful way. It is important to state that it is only by participating in the scheme at an acceptable threshold, by making fair and meaningful contributions, that the waiver could apply to any organisation. In the absence of that fair and meaningful contribution, survivors will be able to receive their redress payment and still retain the option to raise legal action against the organisation. It is my judgment that removing waiver would have a significant impact on the government's ability to secure financial contributions for redress payments to survivors. We know this from our extensive engagement with organisations and from the written evidence submitted at stage 1. Survivors responded in large numbers both to the 2017 consultation and the pre-legislation consultation. And in both cases, the overwhelming majority stated that they wanted those responsible to contribute financially to the scheme. Without the waiver, it is unlikely we will be able to deliver to survivors the redress scheme that they want. For pre-64 survivors, this would leave them with no avenue through which to hold their provider to account by way of receiving a financial payment from them, because, as we all know, court options are not available to pre-64 survivors. Some organisations have told us and told committee the waiver will not make a material difference as they cannot afford to contribute at the threshold required to be covered by the waiver. However, the scheme cannot be designed around their needs alone, and it is important to recognise that for many others, including some of the biggest potential contributors, the waiver is essential. Many of these organisations want to do the right thing, but without the waiver may not be able to do so, largely because they would continue to face the financial risk of civil litigation. I do, however, understand the concerns that have been raised, and we've sought in the bill to safeguard survivors' rights, for example, by funding independent legal advice for applicants to ensure all decision-making is fully informed. I also propose a broad range of changes to the bill which seek to further strengthen these protections. This includes extending the time period survivors have to make key decisions and removing initial determinations so that the waiver will only come at the very end of the process when a fully informed decision can be taken. It also includes allowing the ability to bring a second application for an individually assessed payment to Redress Scotland in light of new evidence, even if an earlier payment of less than the maximum amount was already accepted and a waiver was signed, bring matters to an end. And as I will come on to, the mitigating measures I am proposing now include ensuring waivers can be revoked where an organisation reneges or defaults on their commitment to make the agreed financial contributions to the scheme. This will ensure that waivers will, as intended, only stand in situations where an organisation made a fair and meaningful contribution to the scheme. I appreciate that the redress scheme will not be the right path for everyone. Indeed, it is not designed as such, as that is not something I hide from. It is a route to financial payment in respect of historical abuse for those who currently have no route. For those who do already have the choice to go to court but do not want to do so, it offers an alternative option that many but not all will find attractive. For those survivors who can and want to go to court instead of receiving a redress payment, their right to do so is entirely unaffected. I've carefully considered the alternatives that were discussed in the Stage 1 evidence sessions, such as offsetting, but I do not consider there to be an option that is as workable or as effective as waiver in terms of being able to deliver upfront the scale of contributions we seek for survivors. I've listened to the concerns of those that have given evidence, and I do not in any way dismiss, but I ask colleagues to consider carefully what it is that we are seeking to do. I believe that to achieve the aim of providing meaningful redress, which includes payments containing a contribution from providers, like other schemes around the world, our scheme must include the waiver. For the reasons I've set out today, I invite committee members to resist Mr Gray's amendments that have the intention of removing the waiver. However, I have heard concerns expressed by some survivors that organisations who agree to make fair and meaningful contributions to the scheme may not ultimately do so. It is essential that survivors have confidence in the commitments made by organisations who choose to participate. This scheme looks to organisations to play their part and to make fair and meaningful contributions to redress payments. It is only on that basis that survivors can be asked to sign a waiver in relation to the organisation, and it is essential that the basis on which that waiver is signed is respected and delivered. I listen to the concern that waivers once granted are currently not affected if an organisation defaults on their agreed payments. While the bill as introduced provided that unpaid contributions could be recovered as a debt owed to the Scottish ministers, I recognise and acknowledge that this simply did not go far enough for survivors. I believe that returning the survivors' rights to them, as if they had not signed the waiver against the defaulting organisations in the first place, is the fairest way to proceed, and these amendments will allow that. Where it transpires that an individual survivor's redress payment did not include a contribution from a particular organisation because it failed to pay what is promised, that individual survivor waiver will not continue to apply against that organisation. The intention is that survivors sign a waiver on the understanding that they receive redress that includes a fair and meaningful contribution from their provider. If that contribution is not delivered, they should have the right to pursue that provider in civil court returned to them through the retrospective removal of the organisation from the contributor list. I understand that an applicant may choose redress precisely because the scheme has received provider contributions. For some, this will be a preferable way to hold providers to account and receive financial payments from them. For those survivors, it would be unjust if in good faith they signed the waiver but the organisations defaulted and failed to pay. I would hope and am confident that all contributions agreed in our scheme will be delivered. I've taken significant steps to facilitate participation and address affordability concerns. Organisations seeking to fairly play their part in the scheme are looking to face up to the past with integrity. We will work with them to make sure their agreed contributions are made. However, for the prospect of default, where agreed payments are not delivered, these amendments strengthen the rights of survivors. If the contribution is not delivered in full, the settlement cannot be considered to be final. These amendments make it possible for the Scottish Ministers to retrospectively remove organisations from the contributor list. Where they default on their agreed fair and meaningful contributions, they put the needs and the confidence of survivors at the forefront of the process. I therefore ask that the committee supports my amendments on this subject. Finally, the committee recognised the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee's concern that the negative procedure would not provide an adequate opportunity for scrutiny of the form and content of the waiver, given its significance in the context of the redress scheme and the potential implications for applicants. In response to the Stage 1 report, I committed to bring forward an amendment at Stage 2 to make these regulations subject to the affirmative procedure. My amendments 106 and 107 do that. Effective and thorough scrutiny of the waiver is important to ensure that both applicants and organisations have confidence in relation to its functioning and that of the scheme as a whole. I hope this amendment to the procedure for the regulations on this will go some way to ensuring that this is the case. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I have a number of members wishing to come in. I go to Mr Johnson to be followed by Mr Greer.
Thank you, Convener. And can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his contribution there. And indeed, I think for the tenor and manner in which the government have conducted engagement with the committee. And indeed, I'd also thank fellow committee members, because I think we all understand the seriousness and the importance of this bill. And I'd also like to say I understand the purpose and intent of the waiver. This bill is about a series of balances between the rights and requirements of survivors, and indeed the limitations and restrictions that may be on the part of providers, and the importance of having participation of both of those groups. But I do believe that despite, I think, the significant number of changes that the government have brought forward, and I welcome those changes, there continue to be issues with the waiver. In first part, that is around whether or not it actually adequately secures the participation of providers in the first place. as Mr. Gray alluded to, it is far from clear that it will do that. And that's quite simply because if you look at the incentives that the waiver will create, while the waiver would prevent participating organisations from being taken to court, the issue is, at the moment, it's not clear that that actually provides them with incentive because of the arrangements that they may or may not have in place with insurers. In short, if they are uninsured and their insurance does not cover them, whereas it would cover them if they were taken to court, by participating in the scheme, they would be exposed to additional financial liabilities that they wouldn't be exposed to if they simply sat out and essentially allowed people to pursue their claims through the courts. And I think that remains a significant issue. The other critical issue is regarding survivors' rights, and that essentially we are asking survivors to set aside their rights in order to take part in this scheme. Now, I understand and I appreciate that for a great number of survivors that they may not have the possibility of going through the courts or indeed willingness to go through the courts. But nonetheless, I think there are questions regarding whether or not the scheme as currently constituted adequately ensures that they are informed in making that decision. I think there's also the question of the scope, given that this does not cover damages in all regards, and particularly loss of earnings. And finally, whether or not it's actually legitimate to ask people to set aside their rights. It's not always acceptable, regardless of how informed that may be, to enable people to voluntarily set aside their rights. And so for those reasons, I would still question the waiver. And I think in particular, those situations where either new information comes to light, as Mr. Neil comes forward, or indeed those individuals where the cost simply lies outside the scope of this scheme, whether or not this is actually legitimate. Those individuals surely must still retain the right to pursue their claims through the courts. And so I would ask, in particular, in his summing up, whether Mr. Swinney would consider other compromises and additional situations where the waiver may be set aside, either by Redress Scotland themselves, or indeed by application to ministers or some other mechanism. So, for example, in a situation where significant new evidence comes to light, that individual may come forward to ministers or Redress Scotland to ask for that waiver to be set aside. Or,
Mr. Johnson, sorry to interrupt. Can I pause you there? Yes. In the stage 2 debate, the Cabinet Secretary is not moving this amendment, will not have an opportunity to sum up. But I just want to remind that if Mr. Swinney is in a position to intervene, if he would like to, on your comment, if he wishes to do so, and if you wish to take the amendment. So I'll just pause a moment to see if that happens, and I think then we can move on.
I'd be happy to make some comments in response to Mr. Johnson's a very fair observation on the situation, and certainly in the amendments that I brought forward, I am trying to take a number of steps to ensure that survivors have no erosion of their rights, but they have the maximum choice available to them about what course of action they wish to take. And I made clear enough, I again put on the record, that the scheme is designed to give survivors choice about the routes that they can decide to follow. They are not obliged to use the redress scheme, but it is designed to be an alternative to court action should they consider that to be viable. I have responded already to Mr. Neil that if there are steps we can take to go beyond the amendments we have already crafted, I certainly commit to doing that in the course of the remaining period available to me between the stage 2 consideration of amendments and stage 3 to identify if there are other ways in which we can further address the issues that both Mr. Johnson and Mr. Neil and Mr. Gray, it's not both, all three of my colleagues have raised in the committee this morning. I'm grateful to Mr. Johnson for taking the intervention.
Oh, Mr. Johnson?
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that intervention, and I appreciate that, and I would look to kind of work with colleagues and with the government to explore whether or not there are possibilities with that regard. The one other situation is where an application is quite clearly not in the interests of the applicant because of the nature and indeed the quantum of the compensation available. There may well be situations where it is very apparent that a claim, if taken through the courts, could receive a much more generous award than is available to the scheme, or indeed the damages are such, for example, as I've already mentioned, loss of earnings, so that it is very clear to Redress Scotland that the awards that are available to them are simply not to the same degree or extent as might be available through the courts. And in that situation, I would wonder whether or not we should make it possible for Redress Scotland to make an exemption for the waiver in that regard at the point of the award, or indeed to explicitly point that out to the individual. Ultimately, what I'm asking is whether or not Redress Scotland should have an overarching duty to act in the best interests of the applicants, because this is not a judicial process. This is not a process that finds fault. It's not an adversarial process. And indeed, I think in many ways we could regard this as one that is investigative and one that seeks to establish facts. And therefore, I think that would be perfectly legitimate for them to do that, and that would be one other possibility. And then my final point is this. I understand Mr. Swinney's point that this is about making sure that this scheme works, that it secures contributions from providers. And he, I think, essentially alleged that without those contributions, this scheme simply would not work at all. My simple point to him is this, is that ultimately we are dealing with people who were placed into care at the behest of the state, that this is ultimately a state responsibility that we are seeking to set up a compensation scheme for. I mean, while providers may have provided that care and may be culpable or responsible for what happened thereafter, this is ultimately a state responsibility, and that's explicitly part of the bill. And if that is the case, and while I absolutely understand that it would be preferable for the providers to take part and make financial contributions to this scheme, ultimately the state should be underwriting this and should be making sure that if applicants come forward, that they receive compensation, regardless of whether or not we secure the participation of providers or not. That is the simple bottom line. And I accept that participation by providers would be preferable, but ultimately I don't think it's necessary for this scheme to take part, albeit that would come with a higher price tag for the government. And with that, I'll close.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I'm going to bring Mr. Greer to be followed by Mr. Green.
Thank you, Convener. And like Mr. Johnson, I'd like to start off just by thanking the government for the extent of their engagement in this process and their very sincere attempts to find a resolution to what are some really tricky issues. That being said, with the waiver included, this scheme simply will not achieve its objectives. The waiver directly infringes on the rights of survivors, and many survivors have made it clear to us they will not engage with Redress Scotland if this waiver is retained. We heard last month that the main organisation for survivors of quarriers' homes has told the organisation not to bother contributing if the waiver is there. This calls into question the viability of the whole scheme and of this bill. Organisations who've engaged with the committee, including quarriers, made it clear to us that a waiver isn't a condition of their participation. Those organisations who spoke to me were far more concerned by the question of a cap on contributions and the formula used to calculate them. To the Scottish Government's credit, those concerns seem largely to have been addressed. Insurers also submitted evidence explaining that the inclusion of the waiver does not change the likelihood of their paying out. If there are organisations whose participation is dependent upon the waiver, they've chosen not to engage with this committee and with Parliament. We can only proceed on the basis of the evidence that's in front of us. One other issue at play in the waiver debate, which Mr Johnson just touched on, is the extent to which the government will end up paying costs here. I understand entirely the Scottish Government's reluctance to confirm that it will end up covering a significant amount of these costs if doing so might give some organisations less incentive to contribute themselves. But that's the reality. And survivors clearly told us that it's not important to them that the organisation responsible for their abuse make the majority contribution towards their payment. In some cases, they explicitly do not want that organisation to contribute. And they believe strongly that as the state carried ultimate responsibility for their welfare, the state should recognise that through making financial redress itself. The evidence submitted to this committee in stage one was overwhelmingly clear, and our recommendation was unanimous. The waiver must be removed. No evidence has since been submitted to change that. And throughout this process, survivors have made clear how devastating the waiver's inclusion would be to them. If we cannot respond to the clearest message that survivors have given us, we risk as a political class of failing them once again. I can't countenance that, and I'll be voting for the amendments in Ian Gray's name. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Greer. Can I move to Mr Green, please?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, colleagues and Cabinet Secretary. Where do you start with this? This is one of those issues, I think, that's been a conundrum for the committee. And reflecting on the words of Daniel Johnson, it's about striking a balance. This whole bill really has been about striking eternal balances between the technicality of it and the morality of it. And I think it is that with which we have struggled. This is, as others have said, a state-operated scheme. It was a political decision, it was a policy decision made by the government of the day to set up the scheme, and it's one that I think we all endorse. But the scheme will go ahead irrespective of the waiver's inclusion or otherwise, of the contributions from providers or otherwise. And I guess the question on our minds is, how do we ensure a system and a scheme which balances the rights, as have been discussed in great detail, of survivors, plus a scheme which is workable, plus a scheme which maximises contribution from the providers under which much of the abuse occurred. And I don't agree particularly with the point that if no providers contribute to the scheme will still meet its purpose. And I think it is with that that I want to comment most, because I think it is imperative that the contributing providers do financially contribute to the scheme in order for the scheme to close the circle of its intention. I know this is an emotive subject, but the issue of the waiver is a technical one. And the premise of the waiver, the government has argued throughout, and I don't think always particularly well, is that the waiver will secure those contributions from providers. As others have said, very few of those providers were forthcoming, either privately or publicly, to state that link in the greatest terms in which the government stated it. And I think that has created an issue for members of the committee. However, it remains the case that I think there clearly are significant challenges on the government side in securing contributions from organisations if the waiver is removed. Now, the scheme is not, I don't think the scheme is designed to replace court action for many people. Indeed, I think many people who will best take advantage of this redress scheme probably would rarely seek benefit from court action. However, it remains the case that there are those who I think are probably in the higher echelons of payment scales, whatever we agree those payment scales are at the end of this process, who may well benefit from court action. And I would fully expect this scheme to signpost and direct people to all options available to them. I think since we've started this process, we've come a long way. Some of the government amendments, I think, help move us in the right direction in terms of the legal advice that will be on offer and the associated costs of doing so, the length of time that people will have to consider options available to them, and indeed, as we've discussed today, some of the issues around what would happen if contributors refuse to participate in the scheme. I have other amendments which will put on record the levels of contribution that we expect contributors to make to improve transparency as such. And if survivors feel that those organisations have withdrawn from the scheme, if there is further flexibility in the issue of the waiver, I would welcome it. I think the waiver has many drawbacks, as we've heard. They're not all moral drawbacks, some of them are technical ones. But we have to be also clear that no credible alternative has been really offered. Now, it's not the job of the committee to come up with alternatives, that's the job of the government. But I think the government have been fairly forthcoming with all options throughout this process, and I'm not convinced that a credible alternative proposal has been offered at this stage. I'm also acutely aware that this Parliament will dissolve in a few short weeks, and I'd like to see this bill come to fruition. Indeed, I think there's an obligation on us to ensure that we get the scheme underway and not push it into the long grass of the next Parliament. So I don't think, in closing in my comments here, I was never convinced that the government had not explored all options. I don't think the waiver was in there for the fun of it. I generally have never believed that the Cabinet Secretary or his legislative team had this in there for no reason because of all the difficulties it comes with. But I equally accept that the view of the survivor community has been extremely forthcoming in this. But I think we have to separate the morality of the issue with the technicality of what we're working with here. I want a scheme that contributors pay into. It's quite simple. And if this is the way to achieve that, then I think that will offer us a scheme which is fair and just. And when I speak later, I'll talk about fair, meaningful and just in more detail. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Can I bring in Ms Mackay, please?
Convener, yeah, I mean, I just want to, I'll keep my comments brief, but I largely agree with what Jamie Green's been saying. I mean, I think what he said there was absolutely crucial, and I want a scheme that contributors pay into. And I think, it has pros and cons. It's definitely a difficult issue. It's a balancing act, but on balance, I think when you look at the positives of it, and the fact that the pre-64s, it's an avenue for them, and it's not perfect, but I think on balance the waiver would have to stay. And I really this bill's crucial. It has to go through, and I think the amendments the government have brought forward to mitigate some of those concerns, including Alec Neil's idea about if further evidence is forthcoming, I think that will go a long way to reassuring survivors that this is the best way forward. So I would not support Ian Gray's amendment for those reasons.
Thank you. I'm conscious that a hybrid system makes it a bit difficult to have a debate in this area. I'm conscious that there were some direct questions to the Cabinet Secretaries within the members' contribution. So I'm going to go and ask Mr Swinney if he wishes to address any of those questions before we go to back to Mr Gray.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'm very grateful to you for giving me the opportunity to contribute once again. Could I make two observations, please, on the contributions that colleagues have made, in addition to the earlier remarks I made? Mr Johnson made some further remarks about what might be the perspective, or what could be the perspective of Redress Scotland, or the obligation put on Redress Scotland. And I think there's some questions in there that we need to explore further as to whether or not there are further duties or obligations. I'm mindful of the grouping of amendments in your own name, Convener, that we will come to, which set the ethos of the scheme, if I could describe it in that fashion. And I think there may be some similar issues that we perhaps need to address, which are not addressed in government amendments today in relation to Redress Scotland, in that respect, that we could look at stage 3. And I certainly am very happy to engage with Mr Johnson and other colleagues on that question. The second observation I would make, and I appreciate that there is the committee has had a whole range of evidence, both oral and in writing, and in relation to the question of the waiver. And I think in looking at all of that evidence, there has been evidence put to committee the necessity of the waiver being present to established a case for provider contributions, and that evidence was submitted, for example, by the Crossreach organisation, to name but one, in the written evidence that the committee considered. And of course, the committee has also heard from the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities on this question. And the views of survivors, whilst I utterly acknowledge that there are some survivors are strongly opposed to the concept of the waiver, and I understand their concerns, but equally there are survivors that believe the waiver is a necessity to make sure one of the fundamental objectives of survivors, in that the providers who failed them, as the state failed them, make a contribution, is enabled by the presence of the waiver. And I think it's important, and Mr. Green made this point, that the state will of course make contributions to this scheme. That is an absolute given. But Mr. Green made the point of the importance of making sure that providers also make contributions. The waiver, in my view, is an essential ingredient in making that possible. So I'm very grateful, Convener, for the opportunity to reflect on some of the other points that that colleagues have made on the committee this morning.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I'll now move to Mr. Gray to wind up and to press or withdraw his amendment.
Thank you very much, Convener. Let me try and address some of the issues which have been raised and some of the points in particular which the Cabinet Secretary has made. The Cabinet Secretary spoke about the consultation in the preparation of this legislation, and he pointed out that survivors in that consultation were very clear that they did want those organisations who were responsible for abuse to contribute, and that is absolutely true. However, it is also true that in that consultation they were very clear that they did not want to give up any rights to take civil action. And in the evidence the committee has taken, they have been on several occasions, organisations who work with survivors have been clear that in the consultation no link was made between the waiver and contributions, that link was not there in the consultation, and so survivors didn't make the choice, which I think the Cabinet Secretary suggests they did. In terms of choice, he did say quite correctly that the idea of this bill is to give survivors choice, to give a choice between the less onerous redress system or the potentially far more onerous civil justice system, and that's correct. But in the course of that, he said it's not about giving up rights, it's about giving a choice. But the choice we are giving the survivors is to give up their rights. We are asking them to give up their rights, and that's still a very fundamental point here. With regard to securing financial contributions, the Cabinet Secretary has said that major contributors have said that they must have the waiver in order to be able to contribute. But we are still in a position whereby those potential major contributors who actually gave evidence on the record, either written or orally, have not said that. So, for example, the Cabinet Secretary refers to Crossreach, who in their early written evidence did say they were in favour of the waiver, but in their oral evidence made very, very clear that this was not, as it were, a red line for them. This was not the critical issue which would decide whether they were able to contribute or not. Probably the one major contributor who have been consistent in their support of the waiver is indeed COSLA, who communicated with the committee late last night and reiterated that position. But an examination of their case shows that their desire for the waiver is driven by a desire to reduce costs to local government of providing redress. Now, I'm afraid I don't think that is the strongest argument, really, in terms of the moral obligation we have to respond to survivors. And I would say, and the Cabinet Secretary has, and others too, have talked about this quite correctly, very significant concessions have already been made on the waiver, but very significant concessions are also likely to be made if amendments before us today are passed, in terms of the contributions, a cap on contribution, for example. So there are some very significant concessions being made by the Cabinet Secretary today to the contributors. My argument is that we need to make a concession to survivors too, and that would be to remove the waiver. So I acknowledge the significant changes which have been made, and I acknowledge that the Cabinet Secretary has said he will make further changes between now and stage 3. Certainly I will look very, very closely at these. But for me, really, that basic circle which requires to be squared has not yet been squared. And for that reason, I will press my amendments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gray. We will be now moving to a division. When I put the question to the committee, can I remind the committee, if they do not agree, please put an N in the chat, and then I will read out how we will conduct the vote for the first time today. So the question is that Amendment 1 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. Members have indicated they are not agreed, therefore the division is required. The clerks will enter the amendment number in the chat now. A vote for the amendment, please type a Y or yes in the chat box. A vote against the amendment, please type N or no in the chat box. If a member wishes to abstain, could they please type A in the chat box. Clerks will let you know in the chat that everyone has voted. All members have now, once that members have all voted, I will read the votes to be read into the official report and the count, and I will then say whether the amendment is agreed or disagreed. So if members could please put their vote into the chat now. Thank you. Did I prompt Mr. Gibson to cast his vote? We don't seem to have it recorded in the comments. Thank you.
I cast my vote earlier on, convener. Happy to have it counted twice if that helps.
I'm afraid it didn't come through in the chat, Mr. Gibson, but I know it's quite easy for that to happen. Yeah. It's been recorded now. So we have the results. In favour of the amendment, we have Mr. Gray, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Greer and Ms. Wishart. We have 7 against the amendment, myself, Claire Adamson, George Adam, Kenneth Gibson, Rona Mackay, Alex Neil, Jamie Green and Oliver Mundell. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore disagreed. The next question is that section 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. The question is that section 2 to 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. Now move to Redress Scotland's Chief Executive and call Amendment 34 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendments 35 and 36, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 34 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. The establishment of Redress Scotland, a new non-departmental public body, will deliver the independent decision-making that is essential for survivors and others to have confidence in the redress scheme. I recognise that part of building that confidence also encompasses ensuring the good governance of Redress Scotland in a transparent way. Redress Scotland will be subject to a number of statutory duties and other obligations which will ensure its good governance without compromising its independence. While the bill as introduced allows Redress Scotland to appoint staff, it does not require the appointment of a chief executive, as it was initially considered that the relatively small size of Redress Scotland did not require this. However, as outlined in my response to the Stage 1 report, having considered this matter further in the light of the committee's comments in the Stage 1 report, I am of the view that requiring the appointment of a chief executive would help to provide further assurance as to the good governance of Redress Scotland. Amendment 34 therefore provides for this, while Amendments 35 and 36 are consequential amendments. I move Amendment 34 in my name, Convener.
Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary, can I bring in Mr Johnson, please?
Thank you, Convener. And I'll just speak very briefly. Can I just welcome these amendments? I think the separation of the Chief Executive and Chair is important. And while I note that this will be a relatively small organisation, its sensitivity and actually more importantly, its independence from government, and I think that's very important that Redress Scotland is completely independent of government, means that we do need the best levels of oversight and scrutiny and good governance. And it's a well understood point of principle that the separation of Chief Executive and Chair is an important way of ensuring that. And so I welcome these amendments and thank the Government for bringing them forward.
Thank you very much, Mr Johnson. I don't see any other members wishing to come in. So can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to wind up?
Thank you, Convener. I will take this opportunity to reflect just slightly more on what Mr Johnson said in the earlier debate, and also to welcome his comments there and to put on the record my absolute acceptance of the importance, the critical importance of the independence of Redress Scotland and the clear separation of its exercise of its functions from those of government. I think it's important, and I will remain very open to this, for us to consider further between Stage 2 and Stage 3 whether we have the character of Redress Scotland absolutely correctly set out in statute. And if there are issues, Mr Johnson raised a number of points in the earlier debate which I think have merit, and if there are other issues which the committee believes we should consider, I will be very open to making sure that is the case as part of the preparation for Stage 3. But with those comments, I would conclude my summation.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I don't see any indication from other members, so I will move to the question that is Amendment 34 be agreed. Are we all agreed? I'm not seeing any indication of an N in the chat from members, so that is agreed. Can I call Amendment 35 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 34, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move?
Move, Convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 35 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I believe we are agreed. Call Amendment 36 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 34, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved, Convener.
Question is that Amendment 36 be agreed. Are we all agreed? I believe we are agreed. Thank you. Question is that Schedule 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I believe we are agreed. Thank you. The question is that Sections 6 to 11 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Thank you. We are agreed. I will now hand the convening of the meeting over to Deputy Convener Daniel Johnson.
Thank you very much, Convener. I would ask for the committee's cooperation at this point, and I hope that I don't make the Convener regret handing over the chair of the committee. So we now move on to the next amendment, which is Amendment 20, in the name of Claire Adamson, in a group on its own, and I ask Claire Adamson to move and speak to her amendment.
Thank you. There's absolutely no doubt from the comments already been made by members today that we feel the responsibility on our shoulders to do the very best that we can to ensure that victim survivors have confidence in the Redress Scotland Bill going forward. In the Stage 1 report, the committee recommended that the Scottish Government consider including a statement on the face of the bill recognising the qualities and the need for them to be applied across each element of the redress scheme. In the response, the Scottish Government agreed with the committee's acknowledgement of the importance of these values and committed to considering further how this could be achieved. Whilst the redress scheme has been designed with victim survivor needs and expectations at its forefront and already aims to ensure that applicants are treated with dignity, with respect and compassion throughout the process, the incorporation of a statement on the bill will demonstrate the importance of this and the commitment to victim survivors of a trauma-informed approach. The amendment requires the duty is owed not only to Scottish ministers and Redress Scotland, but also by scheme contributors and others performing functions within the duties of the bill. I trust it will build confidence with victim survivors in the Redress Scotland Bill, and I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much, Convener. Do other members have comments or wish to make a contribution? I see no indications in the chat, in which case, if there are no indications, I'll move to the Cabinet Secretary for his comments on this amendment.
Thank you very much, Deputy Convener. I thank the Convener for bringing forward this important amendment following her interest in this potential addition to the bill throughout the Stage 1 evidence sessions. I share the view of the Convener, which was supported by the committee, that all those connected with the redress scheme should be fully committed to treating survivors with dignity, respect and compassion. I fully support the amendment, which will see this commitment expressed on the face of the bill as a clear demonstration of the scheme's survivor focus and trauma-informed approach. It will ensure that all those involved in the provision of the scheme, including those contributing to it financially, are committed to its values when carrying out functions under the Act. The amendment also provides us with the opportunity to reflect further on some of the issues that you, Deputy Convener, have raised in this session already, and the Government will engage constructively in that respect. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'll now go back to Claire Adamson to wind up and to press or withdraw her amendment.
I don't wish to make any further comment, but I do wish to press the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We then move on to the question, and the question is that whether or not Amendment 20 be agreed. Are we all agreed? And if we could just indicate to the contrary if there are any. With no indications to the contrary, I therefore affirm that this amendment has been agreed, and I now hand back the chair to the Convener.
Thank you very much, Mr Johnson. We will now move to Scheme Contributions Acknowledgement of Harm, and I call on Amendment 21 in the name of Daniel Johnson in a group on its own, and I would invite Mr Johnson to move and speak to the amendment.
Thank you very much, Convener. In many ways, this amendment follows on from your own amendment about establishing, I think, the clear intent and principles which lie behind Redress Scotland. From the outset of the examination of this bill, I have been wrestling with the fact that this is not a judicial process, and explicitly Redress Scotland will not find liability or specific fault. And I think this raises both a practical and a point of principle, which I felt requires a remedy on the face of the bill. The principle being that the providers, by taking part and by making compensation, have to acknowledge that their responsibilities in terms of the harm caused to the individuals who are receiving compensation. I think that is a really important point of principle. And while I understand the reasons why the Redress Scotland will not be finding formal liability, I think accepting that point of principle is important. There's also, I think, a practical point here as well, in which, under the way that the scheme is currently configured, as I understand it, it would be more than possible for providers to participate, pay into the scheme, to make compensation settlements with individuals through this scheme, and yet once that is all done, be able to claim that they did, quote unquote, nothing wrong. I think it's important that that is made absolutely impossible, that participation in the scheme it requires an acknowledgement of the harms done and the wrongfulness of that, and indeed their responsibility in doing so. So that is the intent behind this amendment. I would also add that I will listen to contributions made through the debate. I understand that there will be complexities in terms of the form of words that are used in such an amendment, in terms of this broad acknowledgement of wrongfulness. And I may choose to withdraw this amendment at the close of that debate if the government is willing to work with me to find a more suitable form of words, or indeed if the government feels that this form of words is adequate, I will press, but I will be very mindful and will listen to the contributions made in this section.
Great.
Thank
Can
you.
I remind? Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Can I remind members to put an R in the chat if they wish to contribute to the debate? I'm not seeing any indications at the moment, but I'll pause a few seconds in case anyone wants to come in. Right, in that case, I could invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak.
Thank you very much, Convener. I thank Mr Johnson for bringing forward this amendment, and I absolutely agree with him on the sentiment behind it. I share his determination that this scheme provides tangible acknowledgement of the harms of the past and of the failings that led to that harm. So while I see some difficulties with the detail of his amendments, I do hope he will agree to work with me in introducing amendments at stage 3 to address the same effect. Underpinning the concept of provider contributions to the scheme is acknowledgement of the role of those providers in looking after children at the time they were abused. Those organisations which participate in the redress scheme must do so with integrity and with the understanding that a fair and meaningful contribution is one that acknowledges the harm arising from historical child abuse within care settings. Participation in the redress scheme is more than a financial transaction. That sense of acknowledgement, of facing up to the past with honesty and candour, a willingness to apologise, is essential to committing to the national collective endeavour that this scheme represents. I believe it is these fundamental principles of participation which Mr Johnson has sought to reflect through this amendment, and I share that objective. Deliberately, the redress scheme does not seek to establish liability. The approach we have followed allows providers to participate in the scheme by making fair and meaningful contributions without that having legal consequences beyond the redress scheme itself. It allows them to participate in a process which follows different rules to court, where they would have the opportunity to examine and challenge evidence against them, because the consequences of redress determinations are different to those made by a court. For applicants, that approach allows a faster, more survivor-focused and trauma-informed path to redress than is found in the civil courts. The risk of the current amendments is that it could be interpreted to mean that the making of a contribution meant that organisations were accepting legal liability. This would have consequences beyond the scheme itself, leaving the organisations with greater exposure to litigation. Ironically, it may mean that those organisations most interested in contributing would find themselves at most risk of costly litigation, in turn reducing their ability to make a contribution. I would ask that Mr Johnson does not press this amendment at this stage on the basis that he and I work together in the coming weeks to further explore what can be done to meet an objective that is common to us both, and I think common to the committee as a whole. I want to ensure contributions are given and received in the right spirit for the benefit of survivors. I am certain that we can find a suitable way to address this critical issue in advance of stage 3, and I commit myself so acting in the weeks to come. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Could I invite Mr Johnson to wind up and to press or withdraw his amendment?
Thank you very much, Convener, and can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his constructive remarks, and I quite agree with his broad points and understand the specific points and the issues with the amendment as currently drafted, and on that basis I will withdraw it and look forward to working in the coming weeks to draft something that adequately addresses this point. Many thanks.
Many thanks, Mr Johnson. We will now move to scheme contributors. Amount of contribution, publication affordability and use of charitable funds. Can I call Amendment 37 in the name of Jamie Green, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings? Can I invite Mr Green to move Amendment 37 and to speak to all amendments in the group?
Thank you, Convener. First of all, move Amendment 37. This group of amendments largely falls into two categories. One, the first being the publication of financial amounts, and the second being the issue of affordability. I'll start with the first. I think it's important that the scheme that the bill establishes is as transparent as it can be. And I think whilst the list of contributors and a statement of principles underpinning the scheme are essential aspects, I think the bill should go further and offer clarity about the nature of the contributions made to the scheme. I think survivors must be provided with all the information necessary for them to make an informed decision about whether or not they apply for the scheme, and if they do, whether or not we accept a proposed payment. I think there is merit in explicitly including in the requirement to publish contribution amounts on the face of the bill. This requirement will give survivors a greater understanding of how the organisations that are relevant to them have committed to contribute to the scheme, or indeed confirm that they have not committed to contribute to the scheme, and that's an important point which may be more necessary than ever if that affects issues around the waiver, as we previously discussed. The publication of the contribution amounts, I think, will also demonstrate commitment from an organisation to work with the spirit of the scheme as well. Amendments 37, 39, 41 and 42 are aimed to enhance confidence in the scheme on the part of the survivors and those organisations who are looking to play their part. Different organisations clearly will contribute different amounts depending on their historical legacy and the nature of the organisations. I'm reassured that the government will look to that legacy to ensure that organisations make fair contributions which address their legacy with fairness and proportionality. So publishing the amounts committed to the scheme demonstrates, I think, our commitment to ensure that the scheme is as open and transparent as it can be. Turning to the second issue, which is, I think, perhaps an important one around affordability of the scheme. We as a committee took evidence that around the affordability of contributions, it was a key concern for many provider organisations as one of the deciding factors in whether or not they would choose to participate in the scheme. We have to bear in mind this is not a compulsory scheme. The government cannot mandate any providers or organisation contribute. So therefore the scheme itself must be workable in order to maximise contributions. We reflected these concerns as a committee in our Stage 1 report, and we suggested that the government should consider this further. I'd like to thank the government and its team for working with me on this to develop wording which I think reflects the concept of fair, meaningful and affordable. I think this issue is crucial, actually, as we talked about, because this scheme will operate irrespective of contributions from organisations. But if organisations do have difficulty with the initial proposed levels of contributions that was being asked of them, and again, we don't know what those numbers were, but we have to take at face value that they did have an uncomfortable view of this. My amendments seek to ensure that the affordability of the payments are a consideration by ministers when negotiating those contribution amounts. And I think the reason that's important is because the history of care in Scotland is very wide, varied and complex, as is the nature of the organisations. Some are religious organisations, some are public sector bodies, some are small charitable trusts, and indeed some of them simply don't exist anymore. What they do have in common, though, is the significant financial challenges of those who do currently operate. I think events made worse by the pandemic in this past year. I want to ensure that they do participate, but they participate in a way that does not threaten their current viability as going concerns, but equally that their payments are fair and meaningful for survivors. And again, it comes back to that concept of what strikes a balance, what seems to be fair on both sides. I think the matter of affordability should never diminish the commitment of organisations to the redress scheme, but nor should we make survivors feel responsible for the financial circumstances of the organisations that previously caused them such harm. I think more organisations have a moral obligation to face up to the harms of the past, but equally that participating in the scheme and facing up to that moral obligation not be the detriment of anyone who uses the services of that. Many survivors said that to us. I think getting that balance has not been easy. Equally, the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator flagged concerns to us that significant contributions that came from either reserves or restricted funds would put charities in extremely difficult positions. So I would ask members I look forward to any contributions from members on this, but I would ask them to consider supporting my amendment so that the issue of affordability is a factor when the government negotiates the amounts of contributions that these providers will contribute. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Could I invite Mr. Gray to speak to Amendment 4 and the other amendments in this group?
Thanks very much, Convener. I speak to Amendment 4 in my name. In evidence, we did hear a great deal about contributions and the concerns of charities who do wish to contribute, who recognise they have a moral obligation to do so, but feared that they would not be able to do so because the size of contribution required of them, because it was not clear what fair and meaningful really means. Now, other amendments deal with various aspects of this, and Jamie Green has moved his amendments which do some of that, and I will certainly support those amendments. But Amendment 4 makes absolutely clear that one of those criteria is the future sustainability of the charity, particularly where they continue to provide valuable care or other services today. Simply put, in seeking to right the wrongs of the care system of the past, we should be careful not to destroy the care system of the present. The combination of this with other changes to the bill, as being debated today regarding a cap on contributions, for example, and the maintenance of reserved or restricted funds, should make it much more likely that the trustees of a charity will be able to recommend participation in the scheme while not jeopardising their legal duty to protect the interests of the charity of which they are trustees. So the amendments in this group, I think, go a long way towards making participation in the scheme more likely on the part of many charities. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. Could I bring the Cabinet Secretary to invite him to speak to Amendment 49 and other amendments in the group?
Thank you, Convener, and I'm grateful to Mr. Green for bringing forward amendments 37, 39, 41 and 42. I share Mr. Green's call for contribution amounts to be understood in context. That context is, after all, an important part of our redress work. How can we understand what a fair contribution should be if we do not understand the organisation, the past and their present? No figure should be thought of as too high or too low without that understanding. I would like to work with organisations to provide the best information we can as to why the contribution made is fair and meaningful for survivors. Our work on redress shows us that abuse took place in care settings run by a wide variety of organisations, some small, some large, some still providing services for children and others today, some taking on completely different roles. The redress scheme provides each organisation with the opportunity to play their part in redress in a way which is right for them and, importantly, right for survivors. The approach to fair and meaningful contributions must be consistent and principled. Survivors have been clear on the importance of openness and transparency throughout this process, and I therefore support these amendments. I now turn to Amendments 46 and 47. I also share Mr Green's focus on encouraging the participation of organisations in redress for survivors in ways that do not risk the important functions that many undertake today. It has always been the intention that fair contributions would be delivered in a way which was affordable and manageable for the organisation involved. Amendment 46 provides clarity that that will be the case. Many charitable organisations find themselves in challenging financial circumstances, particularly in relation to the current pandemic and its impact on charitable giving. Many of our discussions with organisations are focused on how the provision of contributions can be made meaningful, whilst also being manageable within the organisation's operating context and reflecting the needs of their current service users. This amendment will assist in creating the conditions for organisations to participate in the redress scheme through the making of fair and meaningful contributions which are manageable and affordable over time. We also recognise that the issue of responding to historical child abuse in care through financial redress is characterised by uncertainty, as the time periods involved and sensitive subject matter make application rates very difficult to predict. It is important then to consider how that uncertainty can be addressed. I have proposed changes to our approach to contributions following stage 1. I've made a number of significant changes which I believe will give organisations greater clarity and certainty when considering whether to contribute to the scheme. I will introduce a cap for contributions based on the best available evidence on potential applications, which will give organisations some certainty in their financial planning. I'm also increasing the Government's proportion of the contribution for each individually assessed redress payment to a third of the total payment of £10,000, whichever is the highest amount. I believe these changes make fair and meaningful financial contributions more manageable for organisations and provide the certainty to enable financial planning in what are very uncertain times. But crucially, they do so whilst remaining at a level that delivers a meaningful contribution to redress payments for survivors. Organisations have told us that they wish to support the redress scheme but may struggle to do so. I believe that this amendment, alongside the other measures being pursued alongside the legislation, will together go a long way to addressing that concern. It is in everyone's interest to facilitate contributions, for providers to face up to their moral responsibilities, for the taxpayers so the state doesn't shoulder alone the cost of redressing these harms, and most importantly, for survivors to receive meaningful payments in tangible recognition of the abuse that happened. I would like to thank Mr Gray for focusing with his amendment on the issue of affordability for potential contributors to the scheme who are charities. Creating the conditions to facilitate a collective approach to redress is an important aspect of this work, and as I've already described, I have been carefully reviewing the approach to contributions in light of the committee Stage 1 report and in light of the representations made by potential contributors who are charities. Addressing the issue of affordability must take into account the circumstances of the organisation and should not risk current services. I believe on this point we are all in agreement, but addressing affordability should not be to the detriment of survivors who apply for redress. Survivors of historical abuse are not responsible for the financial functioning now of the organisations that caused them harm, and they should never be made to feel that way. We've put together a package of measures which maximises opportunities for organisations to participate, whilst not compromising on the ethos of the redress scheme we are looking to establish. I believe the amended approach we are taking to contributions are complemented by Amendments 46 and 47 put forward by Mr Green, which seek to ensure that affordability is given appropriate consideration and organisations are supported to contribute in manageable but meaningful ways. I believe Mr Green's amendments secure that necessary consideration in the context of the scheme that we are seeking to create. In contrast, I have reservations about the amendment proposed by Mr Gray. It would only apply to charities and not to the full range of organisations that we are seeking to engage with. Section 14 is designed to enable those charities who want to make a contribution to do so. My concern with Mr Gray's amendment is that it introduces an unnecessary limitation and potentially a further barrier to contributions, which are in any event being sought on a voluntary basis. This amendment runs the risk that charities will perceive it to be an extra barrier in law and an extra risk to them making a contribution. Mr Gray's amendment places the decisions in relation to affordability on the charity itself, but I would argue that existing charity law is sufficient to ensure that charities take all relevant considerations into account in making a decision to contribute or not. I've spoken from the outset about the need for a collective national endeavour, and there is no more critical area for a collective approach than the making of contributions. We must seek to create the conditions that allow organisations to join and demonstrate their integrity and commitment to survivors. We must not create excuses, we must not dilute the response, we must not make it easy to withdraw from moral obligations. I acknowledge colleagues' responses to the important matter of affordability. I'm encouraged that we all share the view that contributions should be affordable for those making them and sustainable so that important services can continue.
Cabinet Secretary, I'm sorry to interrupt. Mr Gray has indicated he'd like to intervene in the point just covered. Are you willing to take that intervention?
Of course.
Yep, Mr Gray.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thanks, Cabinet Secretary. On the point of the relationship between affordability and the ability to continue to provide services, I do hear what the Cabinet Secretary is saying, and I do appreciate that affordability of contributions is covered in some of the other amendments before us. But I do think this very specific point about an element of affordability being the capacity to continue to deliver services is quite important. I'm very willing not to press the amendment, but would be grateful if the Cabinet Secretary might consider whether there's any other way or any other place at stage 3 where that might be made explicit.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. I'm very happy to explore further what might be the possibilities in that respect. As I've indicated in my contributions already, I think the amendments that Mr Green has brought forward substantially address these points, but I am very happy to engage further once we see the alterations made at stage 2 to engage in dialogue with Mr Gray and with other colleagues to determine if there is more that needs to be done in this respect. So I would encourage the committee to support the amendments put forward by Mr Green. I hear Mr Gray indicating that he may not press based on a willingness for further engagement, and I happily put that point on the record this morning and commit to that engagement before stage 3. Can I now turn finally, Convener, to amendments 49, 50 and 105 in my name? I've listened to the concerns regarding what the bill says about the use of charities' restricted funds. Although section 15 of the bill was intended to empower organisations and remove barriers to them contributing in the stage 1 debate, I accepted this has not been welcomed by organisations and committed to bring forward an amendment to remove this provision from the bill. Amendment 50 does so, with the other amendments being consequential to that. Removal of the section will mean that there will no longer be a mechanism under the bill whereby charities would be permitted to use restricted funds to make a contribution to the redress scheme. I hope that with this amendment, the provisions in respect of contributions to the redress scheme from charitable organisations are such that those looking to play their part for survivors can do so. And I move Amendment 49.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Can I move to contribution from Mr Johnson?
Thank you, Convener. I'd just like to briefly elaborate on the point that Mr Gray made in his intervention, in that, while I acknowledge that I think these amendments brought forward by Jamie Green are a substantial step forward, I think there is a clear distinction between affordability and sustainability, in particular sustainability of services. These are related but different concepts. And in particular, if one takes a broader understanding of the financial requirements of a charity, in particular the different requirements they have between managing their profit and loss account and their balance sheet. There are a number of circumstances where one can understand that contributions may be affordable, in particular looking at their balance sheet, but in terms of actually maintaining the current level of their services, either in whole or in part, that making those contributions may make maintaining those services difficult. Therefore, while I acknowledge that affordability could well be interpreted in that way, and indeed the detail may well afford for those considerations in what are considered fair and meaningful contributions, I believe it's important that sustainability, in particular sustainability of services, is made explicit and put on the face of the bill so that we ensure that those considerations are taken into account when assessing fair and meaningful contributions from providers. So I am encouraged by the Cabinet Secretary's remarks that he'll work with Mr Gray before stage 3, but I do feel that sustainability is an important concept and should be on the face of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Johnson. Can I now move to Mr Green to wind up and to press or withdraw his amendment?
Thank you, Convener. Can I thank colleagues and the Cabinet Secretary for their contributions to this part of the debate? I'll keep my comments brief. I think the main point that I've taken from that is, to an extent, that my amendments 46 and 47 go some way to improve the issue of affordability, but they perhaps don't go the whole hog. I do accept that. I appreciate the Cabinet Secretary's willingness to work with members. I think the issue of not just contributions being affordable, because affordable is a point in time, whereas sustainable relates to the future activities of all those organisations, whether they are charity or otherwise. So I too would also like to work with the government in looking to augment my amendments today ahead of stage 3, either with me or with other members, or if the government proposes to do it themselves, to ensure that we do take cognizance of this issue of the sustainability of these organisations who do want to do the right thing. And I think, just as a brief closing point on this important section, is that I think it's entirely right that organisations face up to their past and do so with honesty, but also with confidence in the scheme. But I equally think it's right that survivors know which organisations are contributing and to what extent. And I think it should be a point of pride that organisations which are facing very difficult past now play their part by participating in the scheme. The scheme should recognise organisations who do want to do the right thing, but equally there should be no reputational risk from participating in the scheme. And I would go as far as saying that questions perhaps should be asked of those who choose not to. I'm happy to move my amendment.
So you wish to press your amendment, Mr Green?
I do.
Yes, thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 37 be agreed. Are we all agreed? The amendment is agreed. Can I call Amendment 38 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move formally?
Move, Convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 38 be agreed. Are we all agreed? The amendment is agreed. Can I call Amendment 39 in the name of Jamie Green, already debated with Amendment 37, and invite Mr Green to move or not move the amendment?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 39 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The amendment is agreed. Can I call Amendment 2 in the name of Ian Gray, already debated with Amendment 1, and invite Mr Gray to move or not move the amendment?
Not moved.
Thank you, Mr Gray. Can I call Amendment 40 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move the amendment?
Move, Convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 40 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 41 in the name of Jamie Green, already debated with Amendment 37, and invite Mr Green to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 41 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Amendment 41 is agreed. Can I call Amendment 42 in the name of Jamie Green, already debated with Amendment 37, and invite Mr Green to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 42 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Amendment 42 is agreed. Can I call Amendment 3 in the name of Ian Gray, already debated with Amendment 1, and invite Mr Gray to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you, Mr Gray. Sorry, I'm just following my script here. The Amendment 3 was not moved. Thank you. Can I call Amendment 43 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1?
Move, Convener.
Thank you. And the question is that Amendment 43 be agreed to. We are all agreed. Thank you. Can I call Amendment 44 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move?
Moves, Convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 44 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. And the question is that Section 12 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Section 12 is agreed. Thank you. Can I call Amendment 45 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move?
Moves, Convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 45 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Amendment 45 is agreed. Can I call Amendment 46 in the name of Jamie Green, already debated with Amendment 37, and invite Mr Green to move or not move?
Moved, Convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 46 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 47 in the name of Jamie Green, already debated with Amendment 37, and invite Mr Green to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 47 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Amendment 47 is agreed. Can I ask that Section 13 be agreed to? Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 48 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move?
Moves, Convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 48 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Amendment 48 is agreed. Can I call Amendment 4 in the name of Mr Gray, and already debated with Amendment 37, and invite Mr Gray to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you, Mr Gray. Can I call Amendment 49 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 37, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move?
Move, Convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 49 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Amendment 49 is agreed, and the question is that Section 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Section 14 is agreed. Can I call Amendment 50 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 37, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move?
It moves, Convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 50 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. And the question is that Section 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I just noticed a note from the clerks, but it's from earlier on, so I will persevere and continue. Thank you. We move to the section on eligibility and abuse. Can I call Amendment 51 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, put with Amendments 22, 52 and 53. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 51 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Convener, I move Amendment 51 in my name. During stage 1, evidence was heard about the fact that the definition of abuse in the bill is different from the inclusive definition in the Limitation Childhood Abuse Scotland Act 2017, the legislation which removed the 3-year limitation period for court actions for damages for personal injury arising from childhood abuse. The current definition in the bill provides that abuse means sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and abuse that takes the form of neglect, rather than it includes these things, as in the definition in the limitation legislation. We always intended our definition of abuse to cover all of the forms of abuse which survivors might have suffered, and it was our view that the very broad categories set out in the bill achieved that. However, during stage 1, concerns were expressed that it was possible that some types of abuse might be excluded by the bill and would therefore not be eligible for redress. I have listened to those concerns and I am persuaded that for the sake of clarity, consistency and reassurance for survivors, there is merit in aligning the definition in the bill with that in the 2017 Act. Amendment 51 therefore substitutes includes for means in section 17(1) of the bill. Ms Mackay's Amendment 22 in this group on corporal punishment also of course relates to the definition of abuse. I'm happy to support it and welcome the additional degree of clarification that it brings. Potential applicants to the scheme should be in no doubt that abuse was abuse, whether disguised as corporal punishment or not, and all survivors of abuse in care must know that the scheme is there for them. The committee recommended that the Scottish Government should consider how best to instil confidence in survivors that the excessive use of corporal punishment will be covered by the scheme, and I believe the amendment which Ms Mackay has tabled appropriately and directly addresses these concerns. The purpose of my Amendment 52 is to provide additional reassurance that the regulation-making power at section 18(4), allowing us to modify the definition of residential institution, will only be used to widen eligibility for the scheme. Some of those giving evidence at stage 1 said they were concerned that it could be used to narrow eligibility, with the effect that eligibility requirements as to the care settings covered by the bill could change over the lifetime of the scheme, and that a person who anticipated being able to apply now may no longer be able to do so in the future. I want to reassure both survivors and the committee that this is not the intention. Section 18(4) is already intended to be a power to be used to widen eligibility, not narrow it. This power is separate to the power of ministers under Section 21 to create exceptions to eligibility where this is necessary and consistent with the underlying purposes of the scheme. Similarly, that power could not be used to narrow the settings which come under the scheme. It may, however, be used to exclude specific circumstances or arrangements which led to the child being cared for in that setting. For example, short-term respite care may be excluded. The reason we have the power in section 18 is to ensure that the definition of residential institution can be adjusted in due course, should this prove necessary in the light of experience gained during the lifetime of this scheme. We must remember the complexity of the care setting landscape over the period in question. It is important that we keep a level of flexibility available for any necessary amendment, even though we may anticipate that the power would rarely be used. The future exercise of the Section 18(4) power will already quite properly be subject to the Parliament's approval under affirmative procedure. We have considered, however, whether the power could be amended to reinforce the intention that its exercise should result in no detriment to survivors. Amendment 52 provides reassurance on this. Amendment 53 is a technical amendment to make it clear that abuse which occurred on trips outside Scotland will be covered by the scheme. Section 20 already provides that a reference to being resident in a relevant care setting includes absences from the care setting whilst under the care of that setting or a person authorised by it. The effect of the amendment is to clarify that it does not matter whether the child was within or out with Scotland during such a period of temporary absence from the care setting. This means that potential applicants who experienced abuse out with Scotland in these circumstances should not be deterred, pardon me, Convener, from applying because of doubt on this point. And I'm grateful to the committee for that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Can I invite Ms Mackay to speak to Amendment 22 and other amendments in the group?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, at stage one, many of those giving evidence expressed concern about the bill's current treatment of corporal punishment, which states that where it was permitted by law in force at the time it was administered, it will not constitute abuse eligible for redress. A number of stakeholders gave evidence to the fact that while corporal punishment may have been legal in the past, its application could have been highly abusive and often was. This scheme must encourage those who were abused to come forward. The committee also heard that excluding it from the definition of abuse where it was lawful at the time could potentially deter some victims' survivors from applying, either because it was difficult to know what was lawful at the time or because they felt that the government had somehow sanctioned assault. Although I appreciate that corporal punishment that was abusive is not excluded under the bill at the moment, I think there's a benefit in setting out in more positive terms for survivors that this behaviour is included. I'm therefore pleased to propose this amendment which reverses the emphasis of section 17.2. It also sets out more clearly the circumstances in which corporal punishment would not have been lawful, and therefore when it will constitute abuse for the purposes of the scheme. In accordance with the wording of the amendment, where corporal punishment was excessive, arbitrary or cruel, or administered for an improper use or not permitted by the law for any other reason, it will constitute physical abuse and therefore satisfy the abuse aspect of the eligibility criteria under the scheme. I therefore urge members to support my Amendment 22. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Mackay. I don't see an indication of other members who wish to come in, so I will invite the Cabinet Secretary to wind up.
Thank you, Convener. I'm grateful to Rona Mackay for bringing forward the amendment in relation to corporal punishment. I think along with the amendments in my name on the definition of abuse and use of regulations in the future, will I hope provide reassurance of the approach to be taken by the redress scheme. The discussion today shows the care that all members have taken to look to improve this important aspect of the bill where necessary, and I would invite members to support the amendments in this group in my name and in the name of Rona Mackay. I think these amendments help to provide further clarity in relation to corporal punishment and other aspects of abuse and strengthen the bill in front of the committee today.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I'm going to pause just slightly before we move to the question on this amendment. One of our members has left temporarily, and we're just giving them a time to come back. We seem to have been having some difficulty at the moment. I'm minded a little earlier than I normally would but can we suspend for 10 minutes for a comfort break and reconvene at 10:30? Thank you. Thank you and welcome back to committee. Having just completed the debate on the amendments, I am now moving to the question that is Amendment 51 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I believe Amendment 51 is agreed. Can I call Amendment 22 in the name of Rona Mackay, already debated with Amendment 51, and invite Ms Mackay to move or not move?
Move, convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 22 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Amendment 22 is agreed. The question is that Section 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Section 17 is agreed. Can I call Amendment 52 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 51, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move formally?
Move, convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 52 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that Section 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. And the question is that Section 19 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 53 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 51, and ask the Cabinet Secretary to move?
Move, convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 53 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that Section 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. And the question is that Section 21 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. We now move to eligibility next of kin payments, and I call amendments in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Amendment 54 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with amendments 58, 23 and 24. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 54 and to speak to all amendments in the group?
Convener, an important part of our collective response to the harms of the past is to recognise those survivors who did not live long enough to be able to apply for financial redress. During stage one, the committee heard powerful and moving evidence about the importance of recognition of the experience of survivors no longer with us. And in his remarks in the earlier debate, Mr Gray made reference to the point that all of these arrangements have taken formidable amounts of time for Parliament to be able to legislate to address issues such as redress, and for the inquiry to take its course. Therefore, addressing the issue of next of kin payments is an important issue within the redress scheme, which is aimed to acknowledge the experience of survivors who are no longer with us. In particular, it seeks to provide recognition that some of those survivors may have formed a reasonable expectation that a redress scheme was to be established and that they would meet the eligibility criteria, but sadly died before the scheme opened and before their application could be fully considered. The bill, as introduced, provided an eligibility date for next of kin payments of the 17th of November 2016, which was the date I announced to Parliament a commitment to formal consultation on redress. However, I have reflected on the recommendation made by the committee and the evidence given during stage one that this date would unreasonably restrict access to the redress scheme for next of kin. Indeed, I've heard how this would exclude the next of kin of some survivors who themselves had fought and advocated tirelessly for a redress scheme. My Amendment 54 delivers on the commitment made during the stage one debate and proposes a change to the cut-off date to make sure that families of eligible survivors who passed away on or after the 1st of December 2004 can access redress. This aligns with the date used for survivors applying for redress when abuse must have occurred on or before the 1st of December 2004. As the committee notes, this is the date of the then First Minister Jack McConnell's apology. I consider that it represents an appropriate date for the forming of a reasonable expectation of eligibility for any future national scheme aimed at providing recognition and redress to survivors of historical child abuse in care in Scotland. It is right and necessary that we remember the experience of those who are no longer with us and their perseverance in ensuring that we reach this point. My other amendment in this group is a technical amendment concerning the next of kin provisions. Amendment 58 clarifies the rule about prioritisation of applications where there is or was both a spouse or civil partner and a cohabitant. The decision as to which of those is to be treated as the partner for next of kin purposes is intended to be a final one. After that, if the partner dies without making a claim, then the right passes to the survivor's children. The amendment clarifies that the subsequent death of the partner after the death of the survivor does not change matters in the determination of which partner is the specified next of kin. I'm also grateful to Ross Greer for identifying the provisions in the bill around eligible cohabitants, which would benefit from further consideration, and bringing forward Amendments 23 and 24 today. I support Mr Greer's amendments, which will provide a clear and consistent approach across next of kin applications, as well as being in line with other legislation where it is considered appropriate to require a minimum period of cohabitation. I move Amendment 54.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Can I invite Mr Greer to speak to Amendment 23 and the other amendments in the group?
Convener, I won't repeat the Cabinet Secretary's remarks about the value of including next of kin payments, but I'd certainly associate myself with them. I think they're very much reflective of the committee's conclusions in our Stage 1 report. The next of kin payments are a powerful example of how we have committed to listen to survivors throughout what has been a very long process. The purpose of my amendments is to, as Cabinet Secretary mentioned, ensure consistency. We have at the moment in the bill two hierarchies for priority when it comes to, or eligibility when it comes to receiving a next of kin payment. One between a spouse or civil partner and a cohabitant, and another between the children of a survivor and the cohabitant. Where there is a spouse or a civil partner and a cohabitant, the cohabitant has to have been living with the survivor for at least 6 months prior to their passing for them to be eligible ahead of said spouse or civil partner. That's a demonstration of the fact that they were the survivor's partner at the time of their death. There's no 6-month requirement in the bill as it currently stands for the cohabitant to be eligible ahead of a survivor's children. So essentially, the moment that someone were to move in with a survivor and to begin cohabiting with them, they immediately became eligible ahead of that survivor's children. There isn't a clear rationale for that inconsistency. I think we can all see the potential for conflict to arise there. The purpose of my amendment is to require that any cohabitant must demonstrate 6 months cohabitation with the survivor immediately prior to their passing in order for them to be eligible to apply for the scheme. So the term cohabitant would, if the amendments are agreed, be defined to mean a cohabitant of at least 6 months duration. So that means that where a period of cohabitation was less than 6 months, the children of the survivor, if there are any, would be eligible to apply and not the cohabitant. This just ensures a clear and a consistent approach to the operation of this section, and it acts as a means of evidencing the stability of the relationship by reference to its duration. I'd like to thank the government for their support with this amendment. I'm also very much supportive of the amendment in the Cabinet Secretary's name. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Greer. I'm not seeing any other members wishing to contribute to the debate, and I would invite the Cabinet Secretary to wind up if he wishes to do so.
Convener, let me just simply thank Mr Greer for his engagement on this important subject, and I'm happy to confirm that I would encourage the committee to support the amendments in Mr Greer's name and also in my own name. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. We now move to the question, which is that Amendment 54 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Amendment 54 is agreed. We now move to previous payments, and I call Amendment 55 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendments 56, 102 and 103, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 55 and speak to all the amendments in the group.
Convener, Amendments 55 and 56 are technical amendments to ensure consistency in the terminology used in the bill when referring to redress payments which have previously been paid to a survivor. They adjust the provisions which provide that eligibility for a next of kin payment does not arise where the deceased survivor had already received a redress payment themselves before they died. Amendments 102 and 103 are again technical in nature and provide that when interpreting provisions of the bill which involve considering whether a person has previously received a redress payment, account is taken of any redress payments been paid in instalments or otherwise still in the process of being paid. The amendments do not affect a person's right to receive any payments which are due to them. They simply provide that where it is necessary to do so, the entitlement to the whole redress payment is recognised even if the payment has not yet been made in whole. I move Amendment 55 in my name.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I don't see any members indicating they wish to contribute to debate on these amendments. Do you wish to wind up, Cabinet Secretary?
No comments to add, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will then move to the question that Amendment 55 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that Section 22 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 56 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 55, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move formally?
Move, Convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 56 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? And the question is that Section 23 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed on both of those points. Thank you. We now move to extending time periods, and can I call Amendment 57 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with the amendments as shown in the groupings, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 57 and speak to all the amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. The committee Stage 1 report highlighted the significance of the decisions applicants are asked to make within the redress scheme, the complexity of those decisions and the range of factors that have to be considered before, during and after applying to the scheme. The report raised concerns that the time periods provided in the bill for applicants and in particular survivors to make these decisions were too restrictive, given that legal advice and other support may be needed in order to reach an informed decision. In response, I committed to bring forward amendments to increase the periods of time that applicants have to make key decisions under the scheme. My amendments in this grouping today propose to extend the 12-week period that applicants have to accept an offer of a redress payment to 6 months, and the 4-week period to request a review of any matter to 8 weeks. The period given to nominated beneficiaries to take over an application or given to those who want to make representations about reconsiderations is also extended from 4 to 8 weeks. I fully appreciate the significance of the decisions that applicants, particularly survivors, will make in connection with their redress application, and I do not wish them to be under any pressure when doing so. Accepting a redress payment has an emotional significance and a symbolic meaning. Survivors must not feel rushed. They must have the time they need to be able to obtain independent legal advice and access any other support they require to carefully consider the options available to them. As I've said before, for some survivors, redress provides a route to financial payment where they might not otherwise be able to access it. But for others, there will be a choice to make between pursuing their case in court or accepting redress under this scheme. The scheme has been designed to support and empower survivors to make the right choice for them based on the right level of information and advice. These amendments strengthen that approach and ensure that applicants are given the time that they need. Accordingly, I move Amendment 57.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I don't have any indication from members that they wish to contribute to the debate. Cabinet Secretary, do you wish to wind up?
Oh, comments to add, Convener, thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move to the question, that is Amendment 57 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Amendment 57 is agreed. The question is that Section 24 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Section 24 is agreed. And the question is that Section 25 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Section 25 is agreed. Can I call Amendment 58 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 54, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move?
Move, Convener.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 58 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Amendment 58 is agreed. And I call Amendment 23 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 54, and invite Mr Greer to move or not move.
Move, Convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 23 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Amendment 23 is agreed. Now call Amendment 24 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 54, and invite Mr Greer to move or not move.
Move, Convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 24 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. And the question is that Section 26 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are. Section 26 is agreed. That ends the first day of Stage 2 considerations of the bill. The committee will resume its Stage 2 consideration on Wednesday, the 17th of February. Any further amendments to the remaining provisions of the bill should be lodged by the 12th of noon tomorrow, Thursday, the 11th of February. And I can thank the Cabinet Secretary and committee members for attendance this morning. And I'll close this meeting of the Education and Skills Committee.